Welcome to the first chapter of the life of Joseph, from trials to triumph. This is the beginning of an extraordinary journey, where family love clashes with jealousy, and dreams begin to shape the destiny of a young boy. What happens when someone chosen by God becomes the target of hatred within his own family? Let's step into Joseph's early years and uncover the events that changed his life forever.
The camp was alive with the rhythms of daily life. Sheep grazed on the nearby hills, their bleating harmonizing with the distant hum of the wind. Smoke spiraled lazily upward from the cooking fires, carrying the aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted meat. Children's laughter rang out occasionally, punctuated by the sharp commands of their mothers calling them back to their chores. It was a scene of simple beauty, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension. My father, Jacob, sat beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak, the center of our bustling camp. His staff rested against his knee, a symbol of his authority and his journey through life. His voice, deep and deliberate, wove stories of God's promises and the struggles he endured to keep our family together. "God wrestled with me," he would often say, his eyes distant, "and I prevailed, not by strength, but by his mercy." I was proud to sit at his feet, to be the son he held in such high regard. The coat he gave me, a robe of many colors, was more than a garment. To me, it was love made visible, shimmering in the sunlight as I walked among the tents. But to my brothers, it was a cruel reminder. Their gazes lingered too long, filled with resentment that simmered just beneath the surface. The hills seemed to echo with unspoken words. The air, though filled with the sounds of life, felt heavy. It was a weight I couldn't yet understand, though I felt it in the way my brothers turned away when I approached. To an outsider, we were a family united by tradition and toil. But to me, the cracks were already visible, spreading like shadows under the noonday sun. The dinner table was a silent battlefield. My brothers sat in a tense semicircle, their faces shadowed by the flickering firelight. Reuben, the eldest, pushed his food around his plate, the lines on his forehead deep with frustration. Simeon and Levi, always quick to anger, exchanged quiet whispers, their glances darting in my direction like sparks from a flint. Judah, calm and composed as ever, sat at the far end, his fingers drumming against the table, a rhythm that seemed to echo the growing tension in the room. I could feel their resentment like a weight pressing down on me. It wasn't just my father's words of praise, though they stung like salt on a wound. "Joseph has worked hard today," Jacob would say, his voice filled with pride. Or, "Joseph's dreams are a sign of something great." Each word, meant to uplift me, only deepened the chasm between us. Their eyes, dark and narrowed, followed me with every move I made. I clung to my father's affirmations, desperate to hold on to the love that felt like a shield against their growing disdain. But even I could feel the cracks forming. Dinners were no longer filled with laughter or conversation, only the clink of bowls and the muted crackle of the fire. My brothers ate in silence, their jaws tight, their hands gripping their utensils as if they were holding back words they dared not say. In my youthful innocence, I couldn't understand the storm brewing around me. To me, we were still a family, bound by blood and tradition. But as I looked around the table, I began to feel the faint stirrings of doubt, an unease that whispers of something more fragile than I could comprehend. The night was still, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a heavy blanket. As I lay beneath the stars, their light shimmering above me, sleep pulled me into its depths. And then the dream came, vivid, almost tangible. We were in the fields, binding sheaves of grain. My hands moved instinctively, tying the golden stalks into neat bundles. Suddenly my sheaf rose upright, standing tall and commanding, while the sheaves of my brothers bowed low, encircling it like subjects before a king. When morning came, the dream lingered, its images sharp and unyielding in my mind. I could hardly wait to share it. At breakfast, the fire crackled softly, and the scent of fresh bread hung in the air. I leaned forward, my voice trembling with excitement. "Brothers," I began, "I had the most remarkable dream." Their eyes turned to me, some curious, others wary. "We were binding sheaves in the field?" I continued, my words spilling out in a rush. Suddenly, my sheaf stood upright, and your sheaves bowed to mine. The silence that followed was deafening. Reuben, the eldest, was the first to speak. His voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the air like a blade. Do you think you'll reign over us? Rule us? His question hung heavy in the room, his tone a mixture of disbelief and anger. Simeon and Levi exchanged glances, their smirks barely concealing their disdain. Judah said nothing, but the tightness in his jaw spoke volumes. Days later, another dream visited me, a celestial vision of the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing before me. It was both humbling and awe-inspiring, a scene so grand I struggled to find words to describe it. When I shared this dream, my father's reaction was different. His brows knit together, his voice a mix of curiosity and rebuke. "Shall your mother, your brothers, and I bow down to you?" he asked. My brothers, however, didn't bother with questions. Their anger was no longer hidden, it was alive. As the tension in our family grew, so did the weight of these dreams. Little did I know, they would set in motion events that would change the course of my life forever. The sun was at its peak when my father sent me to find my brothers. The heat pressed down, heavy and relentless, as I walked through the fields, the tall grass brushing against my legs. The occasional bleat of sheep broke the silence, but the air felt unnerving still. When I spotted my brothers in the distance, gathered in a tight huddle, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. As I approached, their voices carried on the breeze. "Here comes the dreamer," Simeon said, his tone laced with mockery. Levi chuckled darkly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced in my direction. "Let's kill him," he suggested, his voice as casual as if discussing the weather. My steps faltered, confusion clouding my thoughts. Kill me? Surely I must have misheard. Reuben stepped forward, his face a mixture of frustration and unease. "No," he said firmly, "we can't spill his blood. Throw him into the pit instead." His words felt like a strange mercy, sparing my life, but condemning me to something else entirely. My heart raced as I drew closer, my greeting dying on my lips as their gazes met mine, cold, calculating, and unrecognizable. Before I could react, their hands were on me. Rough and unyielding, they tore the coat from my shoulders, the fabric ripping in their haste. I struggled, my cries echoing in the open air, but their laughter drowned me out. The pit was deep and dark, its walls damp and unforgiving. As I hit the ground, the air was knocked from my lungs, leaving me gasping in the suffocating silence. Above me, their voices faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of insects. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in the pit's darkness. My throat burned from shouting, and my hands were raw from clawing at the walls. Despair crept in, a weight I couldn't shake. Then, faintly, I heard voices, unfamiliar and foreign. A caravan of traders appeared on the horizon, their camels silhouetted against the setting sun. The air filled with the jingling of coins and the low hum of negotiation. "Let's sell him," Judah's voice rose above the noise, calm and deliberate. "What profit is there in leaving him to die?" Strong hands pulled me from the pit, the sudden brightness blinding me. My wrists were bound, the coarse ropes biting into my skin as I was handed over to the traders. The coins exchanged hands with a final clink, sealing my fate. As the caravan began to move, the realization sank in. I was no longer a son or a brother, I was property. Bound and broken, I was led away toward a future unknown. But even in the darkness of despair, I whispered a prayer, hoping, somehow, that God was still with me. The camp was quiet as my brothers returned, their faces shadowed in the dim light of the setting sun. In their hands, they carried my coat, the vibrant, beautiful garment that once shimmered like the dawn. Now it hung limp, torn, and stained with dark patches of goat's blood. It was no longer a symbol of love, but a tool of deceit. They approached my father slowly, their steps heavy with a weight they dared not show. Reuben, the eldest, held the coat out in front of him, his face pale. "Father," he said, his voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "We found this. Please, examine it. Is it your son's robe?" Jacob's hands shook as he took the coat, his eyes widening in horror. His fingers traced the familiar fabric, now stiff and darkened by blood. "This is my son's robe," he cried, his voice breaking into a wail that seemed to pierce the heavens. "A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." My father fell to the ground, clutching the coat to his chest as his cries filled the camp. His grief was raw, unrelenting, a sound that silenced even the livestock. The other brothers stood around him, their heads bowed, their faces carefully composed. But in their eyes, there was no grief, only the flicker of guilt they couldn't entirely hide. The days that followed were heavy with mourning. Jacob refused all comfort, his tears soaking the earth where he knelt. "I will go to my grave mourning for my son," he declared, his voice hollow, as if the light in his soul had been extinguished. And while my father wept, my brothers carried the weight of their secret in silence, the shadows of their betrayal etched deep into their hearts. As my father's cries echoed in the camp, my journey as a slave began. Far from the home I once knew, I faced a future shrouded in uncertainty, but one that would ultimately be shaped by God's unseen hand. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a vast expanse of golden dunes rippling under the weight of the scorching sun. Each step of the camels was deliberate, their hooves sinking into the soft sand with a rhythmic crunch. The ropes binding my wrists bit into my skin, leaving raw, angry marks. I sat slumped against the side of a cart, the coarse wood digging into my back, each jolt of the journey sending sharp pains through my body. The air was dry, so dry it seemed to leach the moisture from my very soul. My throat burned, parched from thirst, but my cries for water went unanswered. Around me, the traders spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their laughter and shouts foreign and harsh. I felt like an outsider in every sense of the word, a stranger not just to them, but to myself. Who was I now, stripped of my coat, my home, and my family? As the caravan pressed on, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and orange. The beauty of it was almost unbearable, a cruel contrast to the despair that churned within me. "Why, God?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the creak of the wheels and the groaning of the camels. "Why have you allowed this to happen?" The silence that followed was heavy, as though even the heavens had turned their back on me. But deep within that silence, a flicker of hope remained, a whisper I couldn't fully grasp, but one that refused to be extinguished. "I am with you," it seemed to say. It was faint, barely more than a thought, but it was enough to cling to as the desert stretched on, and the night swallowed us whole. Though my journey was shrouded in uncertainty, I held on to that faint whisper of hope, unaware of the plans God had for me and the path that lay ahead. As the caravan carried me further from the life I once knew, I couldn't help but think of my father. I pictured him sitting beneath the oak tree, his hands clasped in prayer, the weight of his grief pressing him to the ground. I could almost hear his voice, cracked with sorrow, calling my name in the night. The thought was like a dagger, sharp and unrelenting. Would he ever know the truth? Or would he carry this pain with him to his grave? My brothers' faces flashed in my mind, their expressions cold and detached. How could they do this? The question haunted me, twisting in my chest like a knot that couldn't be untied. Betrayal from strangers was one thing, but from my own blood? It was a wound that cut deeper than any blade, one that I feared might never heal. And yet, amid the despair, a small voice stirred within me, a whisper that dared to speak of hope. "Your story isn't over," it seemed to say. "This is only the beginning." The thought was both comforting and terrifying. What could possibly lie ahead on this road of suffering? Have you ever felt abandoned by those you trusted most? Betrayed by the very people who were meant to protect you? How do you find the strength to keep going when the world feels like it's crumbling beneath your feet? My story is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, God's plan is still unfolding. One step, one trial, one whisper of hope at a time.
In this chapter, we followed the early steps of Joseph's tumultuous journey. His father's special love, his bold dreams, and his brother's growing jealousy set the stage for a dramatic conflict. Yet this is only the beginning, a piece of the larger masterpiece that God is crafting. Have you ever felt betrayed by those closest to you? How do you continue to trust when the people you love seem to turn against you? Joseph's story reminds us that even in betrayal and jealousy, God is working behind the scenes to fulfill a greater plan. But what comes next? Will Joseph lose faith as he is sold like a common good? In the harshest circumstances, what meaning will he find? Join us for the next chapter, where trials become stepping stones to the miraculous. If this chapter moved you, don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal like Joseph? and subscribe to God's Story to continue exploring the profound lessons of Joseph's incredible journey. Joseph's journey teaches us that every trial is part of God's loving plan. Even in the darkest moments, trust that God is near, preparing you for a purpose greater than you can imagine.